So on the next slide, and the one beyond that, there are a series of exam questions that I just want to caveat the nature of. The early ones are ones produced by Pearson Edexcel that were exemplars before the course launched. Beyond that, there are ones from Pearson Edexcel that have been now past questions for the A2 A-level papers. I have also used AS paper questions and reconstructed them into the format of the A2 linear Year 13 exam format. All of that's Pearson. Beyond that, where the asterisk is, and below that, are ones that I've created myself through anticipating themes that could cover both novels. As you get further down, I'm scraping the barrel and they're probably absurdly hard, I hope. Equally, I've also included some that might be questions I've lifted from other exam boards such as AQA and twisted into Pearson's format. So the format for Edexcel is always going to be compare the ways in which your two chosen texts do blah-de-blah with regard to a theme, followed by you must relate your discussion to relevant contextual factors. It will always be you must relate your discussion to relevant contextual factors. Note the phrasing there, please. It says relevant contextual factors. You must discern what's relevant to the theme of the question, not just bolting on any bit of history you remember. So, compare the ways in which your two chosen texts use the narrators in their works was an early exemplar question that was technical. Relate to relevant contextual factors. Compare the ways in which the writers of your two chosen texts present the role of gender in the misuse of science. Use the narrators, present the role of gender in the misuse of science. Present what it means to be human. Convey fear of the unknown. Show how science can create victims. Make use of different voices. Those are either exemplars, narrators, gender and science, or early questions. Notice that use of different voices is the same question as narrators. Characters responding to adversity. I think I've manipulated that from an AS one, but I might be mistaken. I can't remember now, it's a few years. Anxieties about scientific development. Convey criticism of human behaviour. Present characters' sense of hope. And its antithesis a few further down, create a sense of threat. Present courage. Present the impact of science on personal freedom. Make use of locations, a technical one that I thought was quite difficult. I advised a long while back, which you may or may not recall, that I really would go for the theme question, not the technical. Use of locations was the either AS or A2 technical question in 2019, what I call it a technical question versus a theme question. Interestingly, that year, one paper, the AS, talked about settings, and then a week later, the A2 paper was locations, which I thought incredibly parallel. It's a dangerous game to assume we can ever have anything like that again. so don't think anything of it, just an observation. A wonderful 2019 question, present warnings about the future, and I'm going to take you in this episode through some exemplars on that from myself and from students at grades varying through A's, B's, C's, etc. So that year's were warnings about the future or use of locations. A few further on the next slide and some made up ones from me. Compare the ways in which the writers of your two chosen texts present characters as divided or unsupported is something that I've manipulated, I think, from another board. Present rebellion. That's something I've stolen from another board as well, I think. Present resistance as futile rather than heroic. A tricky question, a brilliant question. I suspect some candidates might have difficulty with the term futility. Characters as powerless. Characters to be pitied. Some great questions there. Below the asterisk are ones that I've completely created from my own head out of themes. And in some cases I think they're really viable ones. In others I think they're probably a bit too tricky. Distortion of relationships might be a bit hard in its terminology, but it would be cracking for both novels. Parent and child in Frankenstein. Trust and betrayal in many dynamics within Handmaids. The relationship between the commander and Offred in Handmaids. I've slipped down there to say to the next question of present trust and betrayal, which again would be great for Handmaids. What I found was that I found it really easy to do this for Handmaids, and it was a struggle to come up with ones that would definitely be viable for both. An individual's struggle in society. A character being dehumanised. I thought both of those that I'd made up would be really viable for both novels. Isolation. Exploitation and manipulation. Oppression and resistance. Language as a tool of control or freedom. Compassion. The barbaric. Moral transgression. Brainstorm themes and come up with your own questions. So I've taught this course to 4 or 5 A-level classes now over the years. Of course, it was launched 2016-17 or so, and the first full A-level cohort would have been 2018. I only had a class of 1 student that year, and I had a small class the following year in 2019. And of course, because of the pandemic, there wasn't an actual sitting of exam papers in 2020 or 2021 for those 2 classes. So I'm lifting here a question that I thought was brilliant from the perspective of somebody who's enjoyed the palimpsest idea, at least, in Handmaids. Compare the ways in which the writers of your 2 chosen texts present warnings about the future. You must relate your discussion to relevant contextual factors. All of my class that year picked this question as opposed to the settings locations one. I've got some examples of Shakespeare ones too if you want to in my future course. So I've done one myself and I've got a couple of A grades to show you. I've got some B's and C's and an E to show you. If you want to just skip through this and pause and read them as you go rather than listen to me drone on, you may well want to. I've not quite decided how I want to format this yet. So I've misspoken slightly here. It wasn't a choice between warnings about the future or settings and locations. It was use of the natural world. And I think locations and settings were the AS and A2 tech question, as I call it, from the prior year in 2018. Given the choice between those two questions, how do the two writers make use of the natural world, or how do the two present warnings about the future, I definitely have gone for the latter. I tend to think that the theme questions are more analytically juicy, unless a technical question, like voices or narrators, is something that you could really sink your teeth into. I wrote this example after the fact a few years ago now, and it's a long time actually since I've read it, so we'll see if I find myself embarrassed halfway through. I suspect I'm probably throwing in too much socio-historics for the sake of demonstrating examples of that to students, but we will see. I've got my plan here. I'm not going to take you through that now. It is worth doing a quick bullet point plan or a flowchart plan. I find a little flowchart helpful myself. You don't want to spend too much time on it, however, and that one is certainly too lengthy. I did time myself and do this within an hour. So, both The Handmaid's Tale and Frankenstein arguably overlap the science fiction genre. There's a little bit of context. A genre frequently employing plots concerned with a tangible near future, presenting contemporary social concerns. I am using that as synonymous with warnings about the future, but perhaps I should make it more explicit. Both present warnings about possible futures. I've done so. Frankenstein takes a romantic, with a capital R, reaction, warning against the dangers of scientific advances emerging from the experimentations of the rationalists of the Enlightenment. I'm trying to get some context in fast, but am I doing it a little bit heavy-handed, a little bit ham-fisted? Whilst Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale presents a stark warning against allowing historic oppressions to repeat themselves. Atwood famously remarked that there is no practice in her novel not drawn from historical record. Her dedications root the novel in America's Puritan past, whilst the brick sidewalks of Gilead clearly link the dystopian theocratic dictatorship depicted with Boston, Massachusetts, setting of the Puritan witch trials. Her dedications are to Mary Webster, a possible ancestor of Atwood's accused of witchcraft, and Perry Miller, her Harvard literary professor, focusing on Puritanism. Am I shoehorning in too much context too early here? There's a little bit of anxiety to demonstrate context here that perhaps is a student's downfall if they try to throw it in early so they don't forget it. Make sure that you are analytically linking it. Just as Atwood warns against societal oppression with her fictive repressive regime, Arthur Miller's The Crucible served to highlight McCarthy's communist witch trials of the 1950s. Too far and probably not relevant enough. The red uniforms of the Handmaid surely evoke the scarlet letter of Hawthorne, depicting Puritan accusations of adultery. Too many, and I need to be actually getting into an argument about warnings about the future and some analytical argument. Writing in Berlin in the mid-80s, too many. Before the fall of the wall, Atwood evokes social control through repression of language use, just as East German vocabulary would have been a giveaway in the West. Is it really relevant? In Atwood's dystopia, she takes the rise of the Reagan-era Christian New Right to their logical conclusion, depicting civil war, nuclear disaster and environmental concerns resulting in widespread infertility. Now we are getting relevant to the question on warnings about the future, but am I signposting it explicitly enough? Probably not. There are several warnings about the future here. Okay, it signposts it's a little more there. But the theocratic state-sponsored polygamy of The Handmaid's Tale depicts a stark warning about the loss of individual liberty, speaking only in prescribed greetings and utilised as chalice-like commodities for the procreation of commanders. As a warning to society not to let history repeat itself, the opening page of the novel refers to the repurposing of the school gym by the Rachel and Leah Centre as a metaphoric palimpsest, a document written over, foreshadowing the revelation at the end of the epistolary narrative in the fictive historical notes that the tale is a transcription of hidden cassette tapes discovered by historians 100+ years after the fall of Gilead. This fictive future appears to have restored social normality, depicting a university conference led by Professor Mary Ann Crescent Moon, a woman, academic and Native American, in a place we can unpick as deny none of it or learn from the past. However, Atwood none too subtly mocks Caucasian self-assured study of other cultures, warning about the future. The guest speaker's name, Piexoto, is borrowed from a literary character reincarnated each century, doomed to repeat the same mistakes. He urges caution about passing moral judgment, Piexoto, upon Gileadians, when this is the very thing Atwood's historical allusions would promote. Even in this restored multicultural society, Piexoto retains dismissive sexist attitudes, forgive my spelling issue there, from crude phallic jokes about the Handmaid's Tale to an insensitive reference to the Underground Railroad, another of Atwood's historic allusions to the Underground Railroad, a clandestine escape route to Canada during slavery. Much like the aunt's cattle prods evoke civil rights marches of the 60s, forget it. That's not really relevant. I am doing my damnedest here to demonstrate this to students, this use of AO3, but it's too much. It's too heavy-handed. And I've got to say, reading this back, I'm not being falsely modest. I wasn't firing on all cylinders here. Piexoto's wrong attitudes, questioning the reliability and validity of Offred's accounts, turn her story into history, questioning her blinkered voice as invalid. That's nice and eloquent. Something she herself questions when admitting she has lost time and apologising for her limping and mutilated narrative. These analeptic shifts could be just as much a result of Piexoto's transcription. The imagery of dismemberment, limping and mutilated, perhaps evokes the construction of Frankenstein's creature, another epistolary structure evoking warnings about future social oppressions. We are 3.5, or if we don't include the plan, 1, 2, 3 pages in, and I'm only just bringing in the second novel. I would suggest that you go back and forth more frequently than that. It is obvious here that I am favouring Handmaid's Tale over Frankenstein, and that's something to avoid. It wouldn't serve you as well. Go back and forth more frequently. Just as the name Piexoto subtly alludes to reincarnation of attitudes, reincarnation is evoked by Frankenstein's full title, or the modern Prometheus. It's a link. Is it the most viable one? I'm trying to be self-critical here. I hope that you're not thinking it's too dreadful. Victor Frankenstein, the scientific overreacher, whose misuse of science warns of a threat to society, suffers horror and punishment for this work. His divine aspirations to play godlike creator parallel Prometheus, who in mythology steals fire from the gods, gifting it to humanity. As punishment, he is reincarnated daily, tied to a rock where an eagle rips out his liver. This is a good bit of AO3 context in terms of intertextuality, but am I overdoing AO3 at the expense of AO1 and 2? And even 4? I suspect I am. I also think I'm ignoring my own advice of not starting out with AO4 as the guiding linking principle of your argument. And I wonder whether this would perhaps not have been marked all that well, despite having a really good knowledge of AO3. It's only one thing in the jigsaw. Like the punished ancient mariner of Coleridge's poem, another piece of context, Frankenstein's transgression over God's boundaries leads him to perish, locked by ice in the Arctic. I'm not convinced we're really answering the question. Initially seeking to benevolently banish disease from society, Frankenstein quickly turns to pursuit of glory. A new species would bless me, its creator. No father could claim gratitude as much as I should deserve theirs. Yet his endeavours leave him emaciated. Notice I'm not really doing close analysis because it is a linked argument. You don't need to necessarily at A level, but I do think that this has weaknesses in other regards. Like Piexoto's epistolary transcription questions narrative reliability, the reader's comparison of Frankenstein's intradiegetic narrative with Walton's more objective extradiegetic perspective makes us question Victor's misinterpretation of the creature, reaching out as though to detain him. Shelley's romantic contemporaries celebrated the awe of the sublime, power of nature, a reaction to the industrial and scientific advancements of the Enlightenment. The future warning presented here is the social threat posed by Frankenstein's creation of a new species, highlighting a number of social themes. In reading Paradise Lost as a literal history, the creature casts himself Frankenstein's fallen angel rather than the Adam evoked by the novel's epigraph from Milton. Frankenstein ought to have nurtured his creation, but he's left irrevocably excluded from society. He blames his ultimate malice on miserable isolation after suffering the barbarity of man. With no tutelage, the creature's base desires for food, Freud's id, are satiated with stolen food, but on realising this causes others pain, he abstains, displaying a naturally benevolent superego and conscience of consequence that has not been taught by any social interaction, Freud's ego, or indeed the nurturing of, or lack of nurturing, of Frankenstein. Just as the creature deeply desires companionship, acceptance and communication through the godlike science of spoken language, Offred's is deliberately quashed to control the doubled doppelgangers and removes all individuality. An ultimate warning about the future would signpost that more clearly as an answer to the question against social control. Desperately desiring companionship, Offred addresses her fragmented narrative to an imagining that her husband survives, warping Descartes' to become I tell, therefore you are. I was rushing here, I think, evoking her desperation within this totalitarian regime. An educated woman, she is well aware Gilead has manipulated Old Testament scripture, citing aspects of Genesis to justify the state-sanctioned rape. The purple placards of the gender traitors hanging on the wall evoke the pink triangles of armbands of homosexuals oppressed during the Holocaust. Often thought just to attack Jews, when homosexuals, Jehovah's and other political groups were also exterminated. Another stark historic warning from Atwood about possible futures. With media and writing outlawed, Offred must struggle to remember details of the time before. As the boundaries of her relationship with her oppressor, the commander, become more blurred, she recalls a documentary alluding to Ruth Calder, mistress of SS Commandant Amon Gert, who she famously asserted was not a monster in 1983, before committing suicide the day after the interview. Offred's tone changes markedly throughout the novel, from trying not to think to believing Luke into being. She uses language from the time before therapeutically, reflecting on the French origins of May Day. Is that relevant? I like the clear and concise way that I am dropping short quotations in to make this flow. But is there an imbalance? Yes. Warnings of future social control, if we are not aware of patterns which threaten repetition of historic mistakes, are chilling in the novel. Offred recalls footage of people fleeing the fictive regime by boat, trying to look as Jewish as possible, a horrible opposite alluding to the SS St. Louis fleeing Europe under Nazism, only for the refugees to be turned back to face death in concentration camps. Just as Winston in Orwell's 1984 rewrote Oceana's history, Gilead has manipulated scripture by omission, blessed are the meek to socially oppress, and centuries later, the likes of P.X. Soto have not learned these lessons. Equally, Frankenstein loses sight of the morals of what it means to nurture benevolent humanity in others. Both present stark warnings about the future. I think that because this 2019 question was warnings about the future, it has led to me overindulging in AO3 socio-historic contexts. You can do it better by using a lot less material than that, and I do think that the argument suffers, especially the AO4 links between the two novels, much more evenly, it's got to be said, driving that core argument. I'm not going to attempt to mark this, or mark myself. The forthcoming examples are from students, and we will give a numeric and graded mark too. So I have sought permission from these students to use their materials as exemplar material with classes, albeit not necessarily on this platform, but they're anonymised, so I hope that there won't be any discomfort with that. This candidate on this question achieved a 16 out of 20 and a 15 out of 20, totalling 31 out of 40, which just put it into the A grade boundary that year. All three of their papers were consistently A. I can't 3 years on remember the coursework grade. It would have been at least A, if not A star, and they were an A overall. You will start between these candidates to see patterns that show that they've been taught by me, but you will also see that there are some very different responses getting quite similar grades. In Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, warnings about the future are conveyed through individual characters and their experiences. Both novels potentially warn against contemporary societal views at the time of their publication, which could result in a bleak future evoked in the novel. Frankenstein largely concerns itself with the theme of scientific development and how, if misused, it may impact the future. The Handmaid's Tale, however, warns against a future brought on by the damning existing social attitudes toward women in the 1980s. Both novels aim to warn about the potential future caused by contemporary issues. Atwood's novel envisions a dystopian theocratic dictatorship in which a strictly patriarchal social hierarchy aims to reduce the liberties of women, I'd argue of all people, reducing the fertile women who serve as the titular handmaids to wandering wombs. Set in the time period succeeding its publication, this novel is more clearly a warning of the future, where the powers of the Christian New Right under President Ronald Reagan remain unchecked to the point where women serve as possessions. Eloquently put. Maybe a little bit extreme about Christianity, but I will ride with it. In the novel, Offred ponders Nick's position in the household, noting that he hasn't been issued a woman. In Gilead, the handmaids are treated as state resources rather than genuine human beings. Walking past the guardians at a checkpoint, she notices that the two guardians salute. They are supposed to show respect because of the nature of our service. In Gilead, Offred and the rest of the women are not respected due to human decency. They are respected and valued due to their ability to conceive children. Offred laments this, feeling like a cloud congealed around a solid object. The metaphor conveys how Offred herself is cloud-like, easy to dismiss or manipulate for the men in Gilead, whilst the solid object, her womb, is the only thing valued in Gileadian society. This reflects the views of the Christian right wing, who rose to political power in the 1980s. They wished to return the female back to the kitchen and back to being a mother. Gilead is founded on this belief system, and Atwood's novel warns of an oppressive future in which these powers remain unchecked. Shelley's Frankenstein also tackles a contemporary issue which would have caused anxiety during the Victorian era, the development and precedence of science over nature. The impetus for the novel's action and plot is concentric on Victor Frankenstein's usurping of God and nature through science. Victor admits, "I pursued nature to her hiding place as he tortured the living animal to animate lifeless clay." Shelley presents a binary opposition at this point between science and nature. Victor pursued nature, evoking the image of hunting an animal, or killer intending to end its target. Victor inflicts pain on the living creatures of nature to facilitate his scientific endeavours. In Frankenstein, Victor's scientific achievements upset the balance of nature and result in the deaths of his loved ones. Shelley warns against a future brought forward by the development and misuse of science to surpass nature. Galvanism in particular appeared to be a usurpation of God's powers. The reanimation of a body through electricity is wielded by Victor to devastating results. This warning is echoed throughout the novel. The lifeless clay which Victor mentions is in reference to the Titan mythos of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to form humans from clay. Prometheus is tortured eternally, just as Victor is punished by the death of his family. Shelley's novel presents a clear warning against a future where science is misused to surpass the sublimity of nature. This chap is deliberately using the word sublimity to take the mickey, because I taught them about the sublime, and then I chastised him for turning it into sublimity, telling him it wasn't a word, and then he proved me wrong. Both novels deal with science and gender as their core themes, and the futures evoked by attitudes around these subjects. In The Handmaid's Tale, the handmaids are forced to wear blood-red clothing. This is an intertextual link to Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, which follows a woman branded with a scarlet A, not literally, for adulteress, on her person to signify her shame in a Puritan, capital P please, community. Puritanism has a large influence on the Gileadian theocracy at its heartland in Massachusetts, referenced by Massachusetts Avenue, the site of the Salem witch trials. No, not quite. Salem, I think Massachusetts Ave is in Boston and is to do with Harvard, but correct me if I'm wrong, I could be. In the 1600s. The handmaids are both valued for their fertility, yet also shamed for their sexual activity against their will with the commanders. This view reflects the contradictory view that a woman should work yet also be a mother. In the future in Gilead, the women in society are oppressed for the uncontrollable aspects in their lives. In Frankenstein, Shelley, like Atwood, warns of a future where women are relegated to the private sphere. You can see how this chap is shifting back and forth, as per my advice, between the two novels, much more evenly, it has to be said, than my example did. Women are relegated to the private sphere. In the novel, the majority of the female characters are passive and remain in the domestic sphere. As these women are passive, Frankenstein is able to usurp the reproductive process, which causes devastating results. The creature is the consummation of my labours to Victor. Frankenstein reproduces without a female and thus denies their importance in life. The subsequent upbringing of the creature is emotionally lacking due to the lack of a mother figure. Victor's exclusion of the female causes tragedy, as Shelley warns that the subjugation of the Victorian woman was flawed, which should be spelled differently. Similarly, the reproductive process is also commandeered by men in The Handmaid's Tale. The emotional side of sex is lost as sex devolves in Gilead into a ceremony which is in reality fucking. Offred's use of this expletive to describe the ceremony with the commander reveals the lack of emotional content. Sex's value is diminished. The child, if any is born as a result of the ceremony, is then given to another mother. Both the physical enjoyment of sex and the emotional gratification of creating life are destroyed by Gilead. Atwood warns against the sexist views of the 1980s, as if unchecked, they would create a male-dominated dystopia. Shelley advocates for the inclusion of women in the active sphere. The historical notes appendix of Atwood's novel encompasses the warning of the novel to learn from the past or else have it repeated in the future. Professor Peixoto, whose namesake is devolved from a figure in Portuguese literature, not quite, Portuguese name, Brazilian lit, to repeat the same mistakes, represents an enduring sexism in society. Despite that by the year of 2195 women and men appear equal, his phallic joke concerning the tail allusion in The Handmaid's Tale, the idea that these views will never leave society, reinforces the idea that these views will never leave society, not learning from warnings about the future. Atwood warns against repetition of America's Puritan past by creating an oppressive Puritan future. I think that's really eloquently done. Both novels paint stark warnings of futures where science and women are mistreated and misused. Frankenstein warns against advancing scientific development through the destruction caused by his creature and through allusions to the young Prometheus subtitle of the novel. Not quite, but there we are. Atwood attempts to focus on how, if the beliefs surrounding women are taken to their logical conclusion, then the future will be stark, exemplified by her portrayal of the Gileadian theocracy. Both authors present warnings concerning contemporary anxieties and how they would influence the future. A grade. Okay, as like the last candidate, notice the brief, quick flow chart of planning. This candidate got the exact same 15 and 16 out of 20, adding up to 31 out of 40, just getting into A grade for this question. Their overall grade was a B, where their other two papers were Bs, if I remember rightly. It's actually quite a different answer in some respects. It brings in some contemporary contextual things that I didn't teach. It does very well. Let's jump in. Both Atwood and Shelley appear to use their novels as methods of warning the reader of a potential future. For Shelley, this involves the potential dangers of scientific advancement, while Atwood focuses mostly on the likelihood of history repeating itself. In The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood's overarching theme could be said to be the idea of history not being learnt from and therefore being repeated. I like the clarity of this. This is made extremely prevalent in the often overlooked historical notes, with a lecture given by Professor Piexoto in 2195. The name Piexoto derives from a Portuguese character, Brazilian, Portuguese name, who lives the same mistakes over and over, heavily suggesting that society has not learnt from the Gilead regime, and therefore the mistakes repeated in that regime are likely to be repeated yet again. This is further confirmed by Piexoto's thinly veiled misogyny and crudeness, such as when he says, "We know that this city was a prominent way station on what our author refers to as the Underground Female Road, since dubbed by some of our historical wags the Underground Railroad." Perhaps that could have been dealt with more concisely by not bothering with the prominent way station bit of the quotation. However, the analysis of it is terribly eloquent. The use of railroads suggests that some of these fictional historians, we can assume male, have not learnt from the dangers that come with the oppression of women, and still deem it appropriate to refer to women as frail or less than. Furthermore, the idea of history repeating itself is emphasised by the theme of the palimpsest mentioned in the opening of the novel, to show how the gym has been turned into sleeping quarters, so has, in a sense, been written over. This foreshadows the fact that we find out in the historical notes that the entire novel is in fact a palimpsest, as it has been notated from cassette tapes. A couple of spelling issues or vocabulary issues there, and therefore may have been altered. This shows her story changing to history. History can be rewritten, so can it be trusted to dictate the future? Slightly loses clarity there, but not to worry. I'm nitpicking. In Frankenstein, warnings of the future take the form of a demonstration of the potential dangers of the advancement of science. This brings to light the risk of scientific advancement doing more harm than good. The main contextual link that can be made here is the practice of galvanism in 19th century science. I told them not to do galvanism. Frankenstein creates the creature in a method that resembles the scientific practice of electrocuting corpses to make them move, seemingly momentarily reanimating. Of course, the ethical validity of both Victor's and 19th century scientists' practices can be questioned, as it could be seen as an attempt to play God. In chapter 4 of the novel, Victor states, "A new species would bless me its creator and source. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs." Victor's assumption is evidently that he would be unquestioningly worshipped by any life he created, and deservingly so. This shows his assumption, and arrogance, that his creations would be thankful to be alive, clearly with no thought in his mind that he may create something that has a painful existence, foreshadowing that his hamartia will be his overreaching ambition. This could be seen as a warning against advancement and misuse of science purely for human personal gain, such as breeding dogs that are more attractive as pets, but that struggle with breathing, such as the bulldog, or testing on animals for purposes such as cosmetics. That's something that she has included herself that I feel is a little bit shoehorned in, but I'd be churlish to criticise it too much. The theme of history repeating itself appears and reappears throughout The Handmaid's Tale, as Atwood herself has stated that everything in the novel that occurs in the novel has happened in history or is capable of happening in our current level of advancement. For example, the wall of Harvard University is used by the Gilead regime to hang traitors to the regime, such as homosexuals or abortion doctors. Both of these are groups of people who have faced adversity throughout history and continue to do so. The purple placards that are hung around the necks of homosexuals on the wall link to the pink triangle symbol homosexuals were forced to wear by the Nazis. The fact that countries to this day, such as Uganda and Dubai, imprison people for being gay, homosexual, with some still maintaining the death penalty, shows that progression has not been made to the extent that it should. In addition, the hanging of abortion doctors links to the fact that many countries have not legalised abortion. Atwood's warning of history repeating itself has demonstrated itself in the new abortion laws in states such as Ohio and Alabama, which now have penalties such as life imprisonment or death for having performed abortions, including for those that are diagnosed as likely to die in pregnancy or labour. Those that have been raped. This also demonstrates the continuing theme of male superiority, as no women voted for these new laws. Roe v. Wade has been overturned in the last couple of days, and this young lady in my class was writing 3 years ago. Atwood is correct in asserting that humans do not learn from their mistakes willingly. I like the individuality of argument here. It's strong in terms of AO1. The idea of warnings of the future could be found in Frankenstein with the theme of nature versus nurture. The creature is used to demonstrate that no one is inherently evil, and therefore we must mind the way that people are raised and treated, because that is what shapes the moral compass of a person. Victor's instant rejection of his creation means that the creature is neglected and alone. Victor assumes that the creature is inherently evil, stating that the creature had his arm stretched out, seemingly to detain me. While the creature may have desired comfort and companionship in the confusing new world, Victor views the gesture as an action to detain him. This links to the use of the Chinese box narrative structure as the creature is trapped at the centre. I like the link. The creature later states that he sees humans as the monstrous ones, he calls them barbarity, as they demonstrate no empathy to those that appear different. In conclusion, both Shelley and Atwood demonstrate warnings of the future in their novels. Atwood demonstrates the real possibility of history being repeated, and Shelley shows the dangers of the advancement and misuse of science. Shelley could also be seen to demonstrate potential repetition of history through the alternate name for the novel, The Modern Prometheus, which shows that Frankenstein's mistakes are not new. A narrow A grade, just into the A grade boundary for that year, a very well deserved A grade. Notice that the award that this is getting is about AO1 argument, linking the themes back and forth between the two novels. It's not overburdened with loads and loads of quotation and close analysis. That's the difference between GCSE and A-level. It also uses AO4 to drive the AO1 argument and uses AO3 really, really well. Historic context. Now I want to dwell on this example a little bit more. I've shown you 2 A grades so far, and I've got some B's and C's to show you too. This one I thought very unfairly received an E, where the candidates' other papers were on A's and her coursework was an A star. She achieved a B overall, and I thought it was really unfair. It was submitted for a remark, and there was a directive that year in the background, meaning that remarks weren't resulting in changes very much at all. It was sent to a few other people who all agreed that it had been harshly marked. I decided in the first page that there was no way it was an E. A colleague of mine decided in the first page that there was no way it was an E. Other friends and colleagues of mine sent it away to people who had examiner experience. They all agreed it had been harshly marked. I gave it 31 out of 40, which just put it into A grade. My close colleague gave it 1 mark less, which would have given it a top B. And out of another 3 people who independently marked it, they all agreed it was too harshly marked. I think a couple of people gave it a B and one person gave it a C. Because the question was warnings about the future, this candidate used my teaching and I think gave a brilliant answer. The only slight thing that I might feel a bit guilty myself about is whether it doesn't quite signpost how these brilliant answers to the question are answering and linking to the question. But I'm being very generous to the exam board there, because I do wonder whether the examiner in question simply didn't appreciate the way that this was answering a question about warnings about the future. Perhaps I'm being a bit dangerous in publicly criticising like that, but I just want to show you how strong this is and warn you about making sure that you signpost how your answer's relevant. Both Atwood and Shelley, within their novels The Handmaid's Tale and Frankenstein, respectively, present warnings about the future, whether it be through hints and foreshadowing at the protagonist's fate, or more generally through the novel's postmodern repetitions, or reflections, of contemporary scientific developments. Postmodern reflections? Come on, this is not E grade. In creating such dystopias on perhaps a larger societal scale in The Handmaid's Tale, as opposed to Victor's creation in Frankenstein, both writers attempt to warn readers of the misuse of science and its dramatic impact. Atwood arguably presents the most clear warning about the future through the historical notes that follow Offred's narrative. On the very first page of the novel, Offred describes a palimpsest of unheard sound within the school gymnasium that now acts as the handmaid's sleeping quarters in the Red Centre. Despite frequent analepsis, such as this passage, she here introduces the idea that history repeats itself as a palimpsest, as something that is written over and reused like the gymnasium, and this notion is emphasised by the historical notes. Surely this shows that it's very, very accurately answering a question on warnings about the future. Did the examiner need it signposting more clearly? In this section, Dr. Piexoto speaks about the tapes Offred previously recorded, which they found and transcribed. His name is of significance within itself, as Piexoto is the name of a Brazilian, they got fixated on Portuguese, character, deemed to repeat his mistakes for eternity. In the same sense, Piexoto is shown to enforce the idea of a palimpsest by joking early on about the archaic vulgar signification of the word tale, that being to some extent the bone, as it were, of contention. By making this sexual innuendo, just as he does sexist derogatory jokes on several occasions, such as his reference to the female railroad as frail road, he reinforces the emphasis on history repeating itself, and that we are, as a society, we as a society do not learn from past mistakes. Such a good answer. This was not the grade it received. Establishing a warning about the future development or lack of development of societal attitudes. Atwood's motif of the palimpsest is further presented through her repeated references to past events and societies, which formed the basis of Gilead's monotheocracy. The epigraph, for example, from Genesis chapter 30 verse 1 to 3, is used by the Gileadian regime as justification for the state-sponsored polygamy, just as the Old Testament was often used to defend slavery in the 19th century, so quickly and eloquently done. What's more, Offred remembers a documentary about one of these wars, her vagueness perhaps conveying how she has become desensitised to frequent and timeless conflict. That's so insightful, in which there was an interview with a woman who had been the mistress of a man who supervised one of the camps. She remembers the interview at a point in the novel when she is developing a relationship with the commander, which makes the comment of the mistress, Ruth Calder, lover of Amon Gert, who was the supervisor of Placlau, I can never pronounce it, forgive my Polish, concentration camp. He was not a monster, all the more significant as Offred considers as to whether or not she can trust the commander. Through the passage, Atwood further warns of a future in which we, like Piexoto, are doomed to repeat the mistakes of history, which we think we've learnt from, and now history will repeat itself as it does so frequently in the novel. So far, we've had about 2.5 pages that have mentioned a little bit of Frankenstein, but mostly been on Handmaids. We're about to shift over. Perhaps it's imbalanced, but I actually think it doesn't matter when it's doing such a good job so far of answering the question. It's completely unjust that this got an E. I think so far the actual quality of response betters the prior two, and I'm pretty confident about that. Shelley too presents a similar warning through Victor's intradiegetic narrative, which he hopes will deter Walton from repeating his mistakes. Victor tells Walton, "I do not know that the reflection of my disasters will be useful to you. Yet, when I reflect that you are pursuing the same course, I imagine that you may deduce an apt moral from my tale." In doing so, he warns Walton of the dangers of the activities of the overreacher, similar to the moral of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a structural and thematic influence for Frankenstein. This work is particularly relevant because of the setting of the extreme polar region, like that of Walton's Voyage in Shelley's novel. Both Atwood and Shelley also present warnings of the danger of contemporary scientific discoveries and experimentation. Offred remembers being told at the Red Centre that the air got too full once of chemicals, rays, radiation, the water swarmed with toxic molecules, and learning of the effects this had on fertility and birth rates. This reflects fears in the 80s at the time Atwood wrote of nuclear experimentation and pollution, and their impact not only on the environment but on male sterility, which was increasing, as well as fertility. Maybe a little bit rushed there. One belief was that the German population would fall below replacement level by 2020, and Atwood herself blamed the 200,000 chemicals being poured into the water. I think there are social issues at play there too. As such, she conveys the danger of such environmental hazards by demonstrating their possible extreme consequences, and by showing Victor as assuming the role of mother and creating and birthing the creature, Shelley also reflects on contemporary concerns during the 18th and 19th century surrounding maternity and childbirth. Okay, there is a fairly stark imbalance between the two novels there, I get it, but that is an answer that is at least 3 grades stronger than the one it got. I don't want to frighten you with that. Marking is what it is. Okay, this candidate with 26 got a B for this particular question. You will see some exemplar material of Shakespeare, Othello from her if you watch that course that was A and A star. She received an A overall. Within both Frankenstein and The Handmaid's Tale, the authors appear to present an intrinsic link between warnings of the future and both the overreaching ambition of science and the judgment of society. It seems the action of the character's overreaching ambition, such as Victor's to destroy the boundaries between life and death, leads to the inevitability of the future consequences. Shelley appears to make a clear warning about the suppression of women in the future in her use of the Chinese box structure, in which the creature's narrative is framed by the extradiegetic and intradiegetic narrators of Walton and Victor. I'm not sure I see the link there, if I'm honest. It seems noticeable that although the creature is evidently isolated, as emphasised by his physical isolation in being trapped between the judgments of Walton and Victor from the judgment of society as a male figure, he is still awarded a narrative voice. Ah, okay, I do see the link. As opposed to a female figure, such as Elizabeth, who, although socially acceptable, even elevated statutory-wise with her celestial eyes and saintly soul, awarding her an ethereal appearance, speaks no dialogue of her own. Everything Elizabeth narratively contributes to the plot is reiterated through a male narrator. This could be interpreted as a warning by Shelley about the suppression of the much-needed female gender, a prevalent factor in the 19th century society Shelley was writing in, and thus a warning about the stability of the society in the future, because the novel is so heavily dominated by the male. It seems noticeable that the creature is only driven to his malicious actions, such as the murder of William, whom he justifies in belonging to the creature's enemy, because he is rejected from society after his subsequent lack of being nurtured. Don't use nurture as an infinitive, please. To nurture is the verb, but to be nurtured. He presents a natural benevolence, at least initially, that could be nurtured to prevent such horrific consequences, a natural characteristic of the female. But because of society's suppression of women, he's denied this. That might be just ever so slightly generic and vague. We need to be careful about how we delve into specificity about feminism, I think. Shelley is clearly warning the future society to not be as judgmental and to prevent suppression of women. A similar notion is proposed by Atwood in her use of the structural palimpsest, which is foreshadowed in the beginning of the novel in A Palimpsest of Unheard Sound, but is only revealed later in Pieixoto's historical notes. Atwood is clearly setting up a warning of the ability for history to repeat itself here in Pieixoto's seemingly indifferent attitude to Offred's emotional pleas to tell someone, anyone, of the horrors of Gilead, and instead only views the tapes from an educational perspective in his hesitation to call the tapes a document and promoting laughter and applause after the moral warning Offred presents appears rather barbaric. This candidate's breaking my heart a little bit here by having a really good understanding, but it's not been that clearly expressed. I suspect an examiner has missed the point there. Once again, Offred's story has been suppressed, both physically in Gilead, in the banning of communication, and in PX Soto's reaching into the past to piece the tapes together. We could do with linking it back to the palimpsest image there for clarity. He has, perhaps not deliberately, framed his story around her story, and subsequently the female has once again been suppressed by the superior male gender. That's a lot better. It's bringing it back round. Her moral warning to not allow history to repeat itself has been reduced to a simple historic lesson on the past society in Gilead, leaving the possibility of the mistakes of the old society to be repeated in this new society. I don't think that that's Offred's lesson, her intent, but that's really well done, and yes, that restores clarity. Well done. Throughout the novel, Atwood appears to make many historical parallels to the notion of not allowing history to repeat itself in the modern era. For example, the use of the 3 new bodies hanging from the wall, purple placards around their necks, gender traitors, could be seen as a stark allusion to Nazi Germany and their actions during the final solution. Not only were homosexuals executed due to their sexual preference, but the purple placard could be interpreted as a reference to the pink triangle armbands homosexuals were forced to wear in concentration camps. The guardians executed, supposedly because they were simply caught together, could allude to this. It seems a significant warning Atwood is proposing about the future in the novel if society doesn't learn from its past errors. The methods of 1940 Nazi executions are reflected in this 1980s dystopian America. Although Shelley proposes a society that is by no means as extreme as Gilead, the author still appears to propose warnings about the future in a time period during major scientific development, and thus the dangers of overreaching ambition. As the epigraph denotes, "Did I solicit thee, Maker, to mould me man?" Although this could appear a part of dialogue from The Creature, it is rather an extract from Milton's Paradise Lost, Good AO3. Frankenstein, or rather the modern Prometheus, Good, makes not be a fire? May not be a fire-wielding Greek allusion, but does attempt to overstretch his societal position to create life. He does play God, this is really well done, a role he simply cannot fulfill. This is highlighted in Victor's ultimate rejection of his creation, crying out that he is reaching out, seemingly to detain Victor. With detain connoting power and action with malicious intentions, establishing a semantic field of dominance when the creature could equally be reaching out for comfort. Victor ultimately rejects his creature and his roles as a parental figure despite his creation of him. This could be interpreted as a warning by Shelley during the time period of Galvanism as a prevalent subject to not fall victim to Victor's hamartia of overreaching ambition also. It's Victor's rejection of the creature that not only destroys the bounds between life and death, but ultimately society also. Victor has no right to play the role of God, and the creature's murderous actions, despite his initial natural benevolence, emphasises this. Atwood also presents a similar warning to the future of overreaching ambition, because the dictatorship-like society that is Gilead stems from scientific destruction. The state-sponsored polygamy method is used as a method to increase the falling birth rate. Bit of a spelling issue there, regardless of the emotional effects on the handmaids. Indeed, Offred highlights this in the use of the rather colloquial term, the commander is effing. The use of the colloquial effing connotes ideas of brash and meaningless. There is no emotion accompanying this action. The word itself appears rather harsh, almost as if Offred is utilising this phrase as a coping mechanism, good, for a situation that's essentially rape. Yet she's suppressed from acting as an individual against this action. She is simply fulfilling her duty, as her red uniform and patronymic naming of Fred, clearly suppressive factors, also suggest. She is metaphorically and physically completely red. She's wearing her red uniform, but is also only viewed as valuable for her fertility, not her individuality. She and every other fertile woman in this society, as a consequence of scientific actions, are simply walking wombs. This is really eloquently put. It really embeds concise quotations with eloquence. It's got a good flow. A warning from Atwood about the immorality stemming from scientific development, a factor, and thus a warning, that this could be repeated in the modern day. Both Atwood and Shelley, although presenting in different time periods, appear to present a warning about the attitude toward toxic masculinity and the subsequent suppression of women. This is highlighted in Victor's excessive use of my Elizabeth. The possessive pronoun my connotes ownership and dominance. Clearly, Victor views Elizabeth as his possession. However, he appears to abandon her in favour of his own scientific advances, which is also, ironically, something that leads to her death, until she writes to him full of apprehensions. Victor only appears truly to value Elizabeth in her death, and thus the reversal of his ownership of her. She is suppressed by a man to the extent her identity is dependent on him. She was gifted to Victor to be his wife, and thus she can't escape Victor's own scientific lapses in judgment by doing so, highlighting a warning about the suppression in this society. Offred also presents a similar notion in defining what men say as pure speculation, and that I only have their words for it. The subtle use of words instead of word transforms this from a cliched expression to a societal comment about the suppression of women, in that even in a dictatorship-like society, men are still the dominant gender. Atwood could be commenting about the warning about the need for balance in society from a feminist perspective, prevalent in the 80s. To conclude, both authors appear to present an argument about warnings of history repeating itself in the future from both a scientific and feminist perspective. It is ultimately the overreaching ambition of men in both societies, either directly, like Victor and Elizabeth, or indirectly, like Offred and Piexoto, that lead to the downfall of women and thus society. This was a very strong answer that gained a grade B. This candidate overall had A's in her other papers and an A or A star in coursework, I don't quite recall. This follows a pattern that seems to be perennial, whereby the gradings do tend to be lower in the prose paper nationally by roughly a grade than the others. I think that's as a result of this being the hardest paper in terms of an hour and a quarter's timing and the importance of those assessment objective 4 comparative links between the two novels. In a similar way to the last candidate, this one is also a B grade and was also this candidate's lowest scoring paper. I can't recall whether her coursework was A or A star, but she certainly had A stars and A's in other papers and came out on an A overall. You might note here that I think she spent a little bit too long on too extensive a plan and may have suffered as a result. This particular young lady had an ongoing target to more meaningfully integrate analytical links to AO3 historic context rather than bolting it on. In both Frankenstein and The Handmaid's Tale, the writers convey warnings about the future in relation to societal and scientific issues. In Frankenstein, Victor's overreaching ambition with regard to scientific development serves as his hamartia, and he warns of the danger of such excessive ambition, perhaps to reflect the anxieties surrounding the development of science and technology at the time that Shelley wrote the novel, The Enlightenment, Rationalism. Similarly, Atwood uses the concept, that's quite a good point actually, if you just dropped in there the Enlightenment and Rationalism, very quick and economical to do, all that bit more sophisticated and impressive. Atwood uses the Gileadian concept of state-sponsored polygamy in order to warn against the pursuit of fertility and advancement in such a way as is portrayed in the novel. In both novels, warnings are also conveyed surrounding societal issues toward vulnerable individuals and marginalised groups in society, such as women and the creature. In Frankenstein, Shelley conveys a warning for the future against scientific development through the character of Victor Frankenstein. Frankenstein is presented to have an excessive sense of ambition, as he states, "I ardently desired the acquisition of knowledge." Both the adverb ardently and verb desired connote a strong sense of will, serving to emphasise the passion and perseverance of Victor in his pursuit to discover the elixir of life. A hurricane also describes the emotions which bore him onward in his work, a notion that relates to the wider concept of romanticism. Romanticism focuses on the extraordinary, overwhelming sense of beauty and strength in nature, and it is these feelings that Frankenstein uses to push himself onwards in the pursuit of the sublime, another component of romanticism. The creation of life is the culmination of the sublime, and so Victor's romantic tendency is what blindly drives him on in spite of any consequences he might face. I'm not sure about that. The warning of such consequences is given by Frankenstein, who implores the reader to learn from me how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge and how much happier the man is who believes his native town to be the world, i.e. not to be too widely ambitious. The imperative learn implies a sense of importance and urgency, as if to strengthen his warning to anyone who dares to pursue such sublime and metaphysical concepts. Dangerous is a stark contrast from the ardent desire for knowledge that he expresses prior to the consequences of his actions, showing that pursuing the advancement of science and playing God with nature has disastrous consequences. In essence, Victor is warning against his hamartia, the pursuit of knowledge, as he knows that it can destroy lives and the protagonist in the process, hence why he believes a naive, uneducated man to be much happier than himself. The extended title of Frankenstein is The Modern Prometheus, and it can be said that Frankenstein is a reflection of Prometheus. In Greek mythology, Prometheus was originally one of the gods on Mount Olympus, but was obsessed with light, and so stole fire from the gods. For this, he was banished from the heavens, in a similar way to how Victor is cursed as a result of his divine transgressions and attempt to act as God. Shelley may have used this contextual parallel to emphasise her warnings against the advancement of science, reflecting the attitudes of many in the 1700s who were afraid of industrialisation and the effects it would have on workers, making for many being unemployed. In The Handmaid's Tale, I'm not sure how viable I think that historic link is. In The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood expresses similar scientific concerns and warns against the extreme lengths scientific development can push society to. In the Gileadian regime, state-sponsored polygamy, you can tell these guys were all taught by me, is enforced as a result of rapidly declining fertility rates due to a nuclear incident in the US before the regime, possibly, leaving many men and women infertile. No men are referred to as infertile due to the patriarchal structure of the regime, but women, such as handmaids, are fruitful, and infertile women are barren. Gilead's obsession with producing offspring can be seen in the epigraph of the novel from Genesis chapter 30 verse 1 to 3. When Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said, "Give me children or else I die." Biblical scripture is warped throughout the novel. What work is that quotation doing? In order to show how the regime utilised the meaning of their own rhetoric and integrate it into religious texts in order to normalise and justify it. If you're making that analytical point, perhaps a slightly different selection of text would have been more useful that showed that manipulation. In the regime, women are forced to conceive and carry children, and in the manipulation of this biblical text, Atwood is warning against the possibility of using effective rape of women to solve a fertility crisis, just as the indoctrinated society of Gilead promotes and idealises. Atwood is also potentially warning against the effect of science on nature, as the nuclear disaster in the US is the cause of high infertility, alluding to the effect of nuclear disasters in the real world. Like the nuclear reactor explosion in Chernobyl in the 1980s, which caused irreparable natural damage, death and birth defects all over the east of Europe. There's a bit of historic context I taught that I'd forgotten about. In both texts, the writers reference the significance of societal issues of oppression of minority groups and warn against society allowing the marginalisation of vulnerable people. In Frankenstein, Shelley presents the creature as vulnerable when he laments, "Here I retreated, away from the inclemency of the season, and more so from the barbarity of man." Retreated connotes a sense of defeat and repression, which makes the reader feel pathos for the creature as he has been isolated by society due to his physicality, relating to the wider theme of judgment by appearance. The phrase inclemency of the season suggests downcast, miserable weather, but in the creature's eyes, this is nothing compared to the barbarity of man. It is noteworthy that the creature uses the noun man as it is a plural noun as opposed to singular, suggesting that he feels repressed and marginalised, not just by Victor, but by the whole of humankind. The creature draws parallels with Satan from Milton's Paradise Lost, but his evil is not innate, as can be inferred from his retreat, rather moulded and created by society and their treatment of him. Shelley is emphasising the warning against the divide in society that can be caused by the isolation of vulnerable individuals like the creature and the hatred that can arise from it. In The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood forewarns of a similar concept in relation to the oppression of women in the novel. Atwood uses the notion of a palimpsest, which connotes a rewriting of history or a story, in order to convey how women such as Offred are oppressed under the regime and to the present day. For example, by the male Professor Piexoto in the historical notes. The reader learns that Piexoto is the one who has created Offred's palimpsest or patchwork narrative, and as a result could have potentially misconstrued her story, turning her story into his-tory. This shows how the patriarchy of society persists to the present day, and that even though the Gileadian regime has fallen, Atwood is potentially warning that the oppression of women persists into the present day. It's apt that Atwood makes an intertextual link to Piexoto, who is a character from I'm unable to read that. Zulfifar, Ghost's incredible Brazilian trilogy. Not something I've actually ended up researching the actual novel. A character that is reincarnated time after time, but repeatedly makes the same mistakes. Atwood is implying that the historical precedents of the oppression of women will continue to be an issue in the present as it was under the misogynistic and repressive Puritans of the 1700s. That's really well put together. In conclusion, both writers warn against the dangers of scientific development and of prejudiced societal issues and the rift they can create between marginalised groups, such as women and vulnerable individuals and the rest of humanity. I think these guys had a really mean examiner for this year. This was given a B. This candidate was A and A star elsewhere and was an A overall. So I was incredibly proud of this candidate achieving a B in this paper. She was somebody who didn't necessarily follow my advice on the Othello paper, and instead of choosing the theme question, which I think that year was reputation, which I thought was a gift, she went for the character question, which that year was the minor character, arguably a minor, of Amelia, and unfortunately her Shakespeare response was a D. I think her overall drama paper was a C. I think coursework was a B. I think poetry was a B. She was a B overall, and this response was a B. Really, really proud of that. In both The Handmaid's Tale and Frankenstein, warnings for the future are heavily explored. These warnings derive from oppression in the past, such as religious fundamentalism and sexism, particularly within feminism backlash and the witch trials. That's probably trying to shoehorn in a bit too much, a bit too fast. And then the modern day concerns with science, such as abortion, cloning, chemical disasters and test tube babies. I'm not liking the grammar and syntax, and I think it's probably trying to do a bit too much, a bit too fast. Atwood and Shelley display these issues in a terrifying light, using Gothic fiction and speculative fiction in order to create dystopias that the readers should fear and attempt to prevent fiction from becoming reality. I think that's a little bit muddled. I'm not sure I'd call Frankenstein a dystopia in the same way. Sexism is a notion within both novels that deeply oppresses and silences the female characters. In The Handmaid's Tale, Offred is dehumanised by having her original name taken away from her, stripping her of a large part of her identity. This new name is disturbingly oppressive due to its possessive form. It is literally referring to her as a possession. Notice the misspellings here: oppressive without double P, possession without two double S's, of Fred. This loss of identity helps to convey Offred's isolation and also the transition between her old liberated lifestyle to her new objectified, perhaps suppressed one. This loss of identity is mirrored within Frankenstein, where the creature never receives a name. Great. However, this lack of a sense of self doesn't convey possessive objectification like the Handmaid's Tale does, but rather a lacking in what it means to be human. Peixoto's historical notes within the Handmaid's Tale help to convey the issue of sexism within the novel. This makes itself evident within his use of phallic symbols and puns, tail and the bone, to which the audience award him with applause and laughter. I really must tell this class, if I ever bump into them again, that they seem to be obsessed with penises. They've remembered all of the rude stuff. This is quite horrifying due to the oppressively dystopian account that preceded. This shock is due to the contrast between the mysterious and melancholy ending. And so I step up into the darkness within, or else the light. And sexist jokes. Peixoto's sexism is also evident in his dismissal of the underground female road by calling it the underground frail road. This mocking tone makes Peixoto's historical notes seem even more bigoted, especially because of the associations the underground female road incur. Absolutely. Well done. These being that they are a tribute to the underground railroad used to transport slaves from safe house to safe house across the country. The significance of Peixoto's name is that he is a character he's not a character within a Romanian play. This young lady is thinking about me talking about declining Romanian birth rates. It's a Portuguese name from a Brazilian novel that manifests annually, century by century, within the novel. This could be Atwood hinting that even in the more equal future of the post-Gilead era depicted in the historic notes, sexism is still evident. Nevertheless, I don't think it loses clarity for the sake of that. Sexism within Frankenstein manifests on many different occasions. This could be due to the fact that Shelley's mother herself was a feminist who wrote a book with equality-seeking ideologies on what a family should be. I think this is the only candidate who brought it back to Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. Notice as well, this candidate is doing a very good job of answering a question on warnings about the future by going into a specific example of it in regard to sexism. This context makes the creature's idealised version of the de Lacy family significant due to the equal spread of domestic and manual labour within the household. Lovely, lovely original point. She seemed pleased and went in the garden for some roots and plants, and the young man returned bearing on his shoulders a load of wood, shows the crucial roles that Felix and Agatha undergo, and that these tasks are both necessary for the family's survival. This family serves as an ideal of what should happen, the equal disbursement of tasks. This contrasts Victor's mother, Caroline, as she serves as a passive female stereotype along with Elizabeth. Interesting. Both Elizabeth and Caroline are known for their kindness and beauty. Victor constantly refers to her with loveliness surpassing the beauty of her childish years. I think this is doing really well in very evenly balancing back and forth between the two novels. The focus on her looks adds to the objectification within Frankenstein, as each woman is seen to have an owner. Victor, in his silence, essentially murders Justine because of his male pride and disdain to admit his mistakes. This is shown within the dramatic irony of Victor stating that Justine is innocent, to which Elizabeth responds, "How kind and generous you are." This statement is not only ironic because he is the cause of Justine's death, but also because it was his hubris that caused it. which contrast the generous label Elizabeth has bestowed upon him. To summarise, it is the danger of male ego that Shelley professes a warning to. Good answer. Through the use of passive female characters and overreaching male ambition, Shelley presents the dangers of silencing and disregarding women. The abuse of science and sexist motifs collide in the form of the creation in Frankenstein. This manifests in the disregard for the female role in birth. Victor creates life without a woman. I had worked for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. The abuse of science is also made even more significant in the euphemism of inanimate body, as the creature is actually a collection of body parts Victor has grave robbed. This is again shown in I had selected his features as beautiful. This is possibly Shelley trying to evoke horror in the reader, especially because of the Gothic language within this scene. The wrongness of this act could also be being conveyed through pathetic fallacy. It was a dreary night. Night has connotations of evil, fear, and to children, even monsters. This pathetic fallacy could possibly also be foreshadowing of the malevolent nature the creature will undertake. Euphemism is also used in The Handmaid's Tale, but instead of being a possible coping device of Victor to justify his act, it could be a form of escapism for Offred. Offred euphemizes, not spelt right, the state-sanctioned rape to be the ceremony. Well, the state does that, which shows the control of language within the religious and political fundamentalism of Gileadian society. This relates to the misuse of religion within The Handmaid's Tale, particularly in Aunt Lydia's Blessed are the meek Bible reference. This originally was Jesus displaying the oppressed people will have freedom in the afterlife, which evokes pathos in the readers because of the handmaid's oppression and lack of control. The irony of the Genesis quote, "Give me children or else I die," strikes a personal chord to Offred, as if she fails to conceive, she will get sent to the colonies. Dying as a result of cleaning up toxic waste. The misuse of science in Frankenstein mirrors Prometheus' misuse of the fire of Olympus, which is punished by Theseus, I think. Now, this person is running out of time, so they've followed my advice. They've not really finished the point they want to make, but they've left a gap in order to make sure they've got time to conclude and go back to it if they get chance, which it looks like they didn't. To conclude, in both The Handmaid's Tale and Frankenstein, Shelley and Atwood explore the dangers of the misuse of science and the oppression or objectification of women. They convey this through having the women in the novels be silenced into submission, or even, in Frankenstein's case, killed as a result of the male abuse of power. And by referencing the past oppressive situations, these authors can profess dangers of the future to try to provoke change and avoid the dystopias becoming real. A really good answer. This was a B grade and somebody who achieved a B overall. So this is our penultimate response. I'm sorry if this is really long and dragging. This was a C grade, this answer, 21 out of 40, which I think was the borderline to achieve C, but don't quote me on that, I may be wrong. This candidate's coursework was really good, it was a B. I can't remember what her poetry paper was. I don't teach the poetry. And and I don't know, we were on the CD borderline, possibly into D for the drama, I've forgotten. Unfortunately, overall, it just narrowly missed C by a couple of marks, but this is a C grade response. In both Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, a sense of fear is created through the questioning and warning of what is to come in the future. Frankenstein is set in the past and reflects contextual situations that were relevant at the time of writing and their future, our now. The Handmaid's Tale, however, is set in a utopia, showing a damaged society that could be, in reality, our future. Both Frankenstein and The Handmaid's Tale are written in an epistolary form through the words of the protagonist. However, in Frankenstein, this changes between Walton, Victor and the creature. This could show the entrapment of Offred, the creature, Walton and Victor, as the only way they can speak their truth is through noting it down, or in Offred's case, recording it. In Frankenstein, the creature describes the spoken word as a godlike science. This shows that as a society, this simple tool is taken for granted, and Shelley could be warning that this tool of communication will be lost if society as a whole don't accept minorities who praise it. Nice idea. By using the term godlike, this suggests that this tool, language, it could be a little clearer, is difficult and only used by those in power from the creature's perspective. Therefore, for it to be used so flippantly, misspelt, by those who find it simple, could cause unrest in the future. This power of words is also suggested in The Handmaid's Tale, with the ability to communicate taken away from them, and words being exchanged for images on shop signs. Yes, but perhaps a little general. This renders Offred's story to be even more influential and important, as no others like her would have dared to record the experience. Great. However, her narrative reliability can be questioned. For example, when describing sleeping with Nick, she states, "It didn't happen that way either. I'm not sure how it happened. Not exactly." That's an emotional thing that I think is clear and could be perhaps explored in greater depth, with a bit more nuanced sensitivity. This can link to the term palimpsest used in the first chapter of the novel, as her story is a document that has been written over. You can tell they've all been taught by me. What the reader sees as the truth on the surface may not be. Through this form of oppression in The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood may be warning about texts being changed and read differently in the future, and how this could lead to a utopia as in the novel. Frankenstein is also known as Frankenstein or the modern-day Prometheus. This could also be seen as a warning from Shelley of the harm suffered for wrongdoing. In ancient Greek mythology, Prometheus steals fire from Satan. A shame about some of the spelling issues. However, it is caught and tied to a rock, left for an eagle to peck out his liver every day, and a new one grows back each night. A link can be seen between the creature and Prometheus, as the creature was made and wanted to do good, but was left suffering daily for his ill-fitting in society. That's a really well put parallel. The creature states, "You, my creator, would tear me to pieces and triumph." This shows that even the scientist who created it wants it to be destroyed, leaving it completely isolated in society. By writing of such a terrifying experiment, Shelley is warning of the dangers of science. At the time of writing, the Industrial Revolution was in motion, and new forms of science were being tested and developed without rules. This is a warning of future experiments and shows scientists to take responsibility for their actions. In The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood also warns about the harms of science. When society plays God and creates a child within minimal input from its mother, the handmaids. Offred states, "Waste not, want not. I am not being wasted," when taking her mind off her situation and trying to daydream by stating that she is not being wasted. This suggests her body has a purpose and is being used for that purpose alone, to birth children. Women in the novel are neither wasted nor wanted, as they are used for either having children, handmaids, cleaning up toxic waste, unwomen, not really a use, cooking and cleaning, Marthas, or being a wife to a commander. They are also not wanted, as the passionate side of sex is being taken away from the ceremony and ritual. Women in the novel aren't seen as useful or treasured as the men are, but instead are used. This may be a way Atwood is warning about how the future may turn out if the upper-class white conglomerates, such as politicians, continue to disrespect and remove choice from women. For example, the 2019 bans of abortion in states in the USA. Atwood also links the novel to the Puritan-influenced Massachusetts witch trials, which stripped women of their individuality and murdered them for being different. This shows that both in the past and potentially in the future, this could happen, and the human race could be damaged because of it. Atwood has stated in many interviews that she only used content in the novel that had occurred in the past, showing that these horrific events have happened and have the chance of happening again. In conclusion, both novels warn of the misuse of science in influencing reproduction and show how society can be affected by either embracing the change and pushing society to oppress those of a lesser power, or by rejecting it and pushing those who are different out. This gained a C. Our final example then, this response was a C. This candidate, unfortunately, their coursework had to be submitted as a D grade. Their Shakespeare element of drama was much, much stronger than their streetcar modern play. I forget about the poetry again, I'm afraid, but they achieved a C overall, and this answer was a C. Throughout both Frankenstein and The Handmaid's Tale, numerous themes are covered. For example, oppression of the female role and environmental concerns. However, an overreaching theme that dominates both novels are concerns for the future. Both authors present this theme, although in differing ways. Atwood focuses on past history, claiming it will repeat itself, whilst Shelley uses a lack of human interaction through the creature to convey her message. In Atwood's Gilead, the society that the handmaids are trapped in is a theocratic rule. The warning of the future conveyed by this unusual choice of oppressive regime is likely due to the rise of the Christian right or fundamentalism under the US President Ronald Reagan. I'm not sure I would apply that as fundamentalism, that might be a bit heavy-handed. The theocracy is one of the clever warnings for the future in the novel. This is supported by the first epigraph, in which Genesis chapter 30 verse 1 to 3 is taken out of context. Rachel is unable to bear children for her husband Jacob, and Jacob then uses their maid Bilhah in order to have children. The link to handmaids is clear, though through the use of polygamy. Linking to childbirth, another contextual factor that may have influenced Atwood was the declining birth rate of Caucasians in the 1980s. The theme of creating new life is maybe that spans both novels, as Victor Frankenstein creates new life, not through state-sponsored polygamy, but through the misuse of science. Mellor argues that Victor's downfall is a result of men attempting to create life without a woman. Mellor's argument is very strong. He is using here a critic as a form of context of reception for Objective 3. So this candidate considered the critic a strong answer, and in my opinion is correct. If you're going to use critics and do it well, tackle them. As Victor Frankenstein did in the words of Anne Goer, usurp God. Don't just show your knowledge of critics. If you're going to use them, take them on, criticise them. Build a counter-argument. The full title for the novel is Frankenstein the Modern Prometheus. The contextual link to Prometheus could show how Victor is a usurper, as Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to the humans. Good point. Linking to Victor as the something electricity, as he took electricity and longer pieces of human anatomy to life, brought pieces of human anatomy to life. Victor, like Prometheus, make sure that your handwriting is legible for your examiner, please. I've lost my place now. Like Prometheus, uses something for this, as the life he had created haunted him, eventually leading to his death. Another potential warning for the future in Frankenstein could be the disregard of female roles. Elizabeth, one of the novel's main characters, is practically praised perhaps for her physical appearance, for example angelic beauty. All the women in Frankenstein are based solely on a domestic sphere. This is supported by the whore angel theory, in which female protagonists can only be one of these roles. Not something I taught. Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was an avid supporter of feminism. This may be seen in the novel as Victor fails to realise the importance of the women, therefore, before they're killed by the creature. Yes, the rise of second wave feminism in the US of the 80s, we could argue third wave, but that's possibly something that I've misrepresented, may have inspired Atwood in the writing of The Handmaid's Tale, as second wave feminism stood for jobs and equal pay. However, people soon realised that the women may have the cause of the worlds. Frankly, I'm going to skip it because I can't read it. Feminism is majorly oppressed in The Handmaid's Tale. For example, Offred recalls illicit fashion magazines, but were supposed to have been burned. The oppression of females in Frankenstein is shown through domestic roles, and the reader is warned about the imperative of females via Victor's anguish at their loss. However, oppression is different in The Handmaid's Tale, as their identities are stripped away from them, instead given a nomenclature prefix of. Of carries lexical connotations of ownership and property. This could be a warning to those who don't support feminism, as they may be seen to become men's property. Something men are assigned women in Gilead. The sexist, even he hasn't even been assigned a woman yet, not even one. The use of the word yet makes it clear that he will be eventually, mirroring the inevitability of women becoming property if feminism has failed, perhaps, something like that. I'm having to sort of make it up. Another key concern of Atwood for the future could be environment nuclear concerns. With the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 and Greenpeace formed in 1974-9, it may be likely, timely, that these are the causes of the birth defects due to radiation and the references to nuclear disaster. A major concern is that history will repeat itself, as in the historical notes Professor Piexoto makes jokes about the struggles of the female escapees, calling it the Underground Railroad. Piexoto is a professor, legend, that was and made to relive the same life many times, making the same mistakes for eternity. This could show how the oppression will never end for females, as the males continue to be dominant, perhaps, or something along those lines. In conclusion, both novels portray the future as something, if the messages, as perhaps the didactic elements of the novels are not taken into consideration, the overreaching ambition and lack of nurturing are explained through Walton, Victor and the creature in Frankenstein. Freedom is a main concern of Atwood, as she was writing in the FRG at the time, where oppression was rife. East Germany. Russians sets flow over at can attribute to more their presence, something. I'm struggling really to read it. Make sure that you are actually legible for your examiner. Anyway, this response gained a C, just narrowly. So I hope that hasn't been too long and repetitious. It's only one question, I'm afraid, on warnings about the future for both novels. But you've had a couple of A grades there. You've had 3 Bs. You've had a couple of Cs. And you've had an E grade example that I would really question. So, my final bits of advice. Make sure that you use your thinking cap to anticipate as broad a range of themes that connect these two novels as possible. That will help you anticipate comparative questions. Which of those themes are viable for comparisons of both novels? And it's those themes and those assessment objective 4 links that should be the driving point throughout your answer of your Assessment Objective 1 argument, whilst bringing in Assessment Objective 2 language analysis for meaning, and Objective 3 analytically integrating and engaging with contexts, whether they be social, whether they be historical, whether they be intertextuality and genre, or potentially, for real A-star responses, tackling another critic. It only remains for me to wish you the best of luck in your examinations. If you've got any questions or comments, please drop them below. Please like, please subscribe, and hit the notification bell for further courses. I am considering doing a Frankenstein one. I think I'm likely to do one on Othello by Shakespeare, if that's your choice. I might do a Macbeth one, but that's GCSE level. I might look at Death of a Salesman or Streetcar Named Desire. I might look at some other novels, Atonement, Mrs. Dalloway, In Cold Blood, or I might go off piste and do something from some of the other boards like The Kite Runner. If you want anything on John Donne and metaphysical poetry, I might be thinking about that. I might possibly think about Streetcar. I might possibly think about the poetry anthology. But after Othello being the next one of the core things that I'm going to be thinking about is the Educast Film Studies course, which may or may not be relevant to you. I'm going to actually put together some material on analysis of the short films for the coursework in that, and potentially the practicalities of approaching producing your own short film for coursework. British film, American film, global film, documentary, silent, experimental. If this has been helpful, like, subscribe, hit the bell. Thank you.